and welcome to Chapter 5 of the Gospel According to Luke Advent Calendar. Chapter 5, Floppy Fisherman and Man on a Blanket. Jesus had a plan. He knew he could carry on spreading his awesomeness by himself, but he also knew that it would help spread even further if he got a few people to help him out. Great team player, that Jesus. I expected that Jesus would choose the best of the best, the super rich, the ones who had the coolest clothes and the biggest houses, but he didn't. He chose a real bunch of flops. People were still following Jesus everywhere. He had genuine celebrity status, and everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. One day Jesus was teaching by Lake Galilee, and there were so many people pushing to get closer that they almost pushed him in. So Jesus climbed into a boat and told Simon, who owned the boat, he wanted a trip out on the lake. Simon was a fisherman, but not a very good one, just recently. Simon pushed off from the shore, and then Jesus said, "Stop, that'll do." Simon was confused. "But I thought you wanted to go on a," he said, but Jesus had seated himself facing the crowds of people and carried on speaking to them. After a while, Jesus turned round and said to Simon, "Right, let's go catch some fish." Simon was even more confused. He'd been out all night trying to catch fish, and he hadn't caught a single one. In fact, he was convinced that all the fish had disappeared. He normally caught a few, but this time he only managed to drag up the odd rock and a few stinky old sandals. Simon looked at Jesus. There was something about his face that seemed different. Simon kept staring at Jesus. Eventually, Jesus broke the awkward silence and said, "Come on, Simon, let's go fish. Row out a bit and sling out those nets." Simon thought maybe Jesus knew where all the fish had gone. Either that he was playing a not very funny prank. But then he still had a look on his face that Simon couldn't quite figure out. Sort of serious, sort of happy, sort of a trust me, it's okay face. "Okay then," said Simon slowly. "Tell me where to drop the nets and I'll do it, boss." When Simon came to pull the nets back up, he was totally flabbergasted. There were so many fish. His nets were starting to rip. As he pulled and pulled, Jesus smiled, and they both began to laugh. But Simon couldn't get the nets into the boat, and even when he called his fisherman friends over to help, there were so many fish, their boats started to sink. Even James and John, pretty good fishermen, had never seen this many fish in one place before. It was amazing. Did Jesus have a special fish radar or something? When the fish just kept on piling into the boat, Simon suddenly realized what had just happened. He began slowly to put all the pieces together in his head. So Jesus had done all this cool stuff. People were following him everywhere. Jesus was in his boat. Jesus had just given him the biggest catch of fish he'd ever seen. Whoa, maybe Jesus was actually... Simon fell on his knees and mumbled, "Jesus, don't come near me. I'm a bad man. I've done bad things. I'm not good enough for you. You're just too awesome." "Simon, don't worry. You're a wonderful fisherman. In fact, you all are. Except you're not going to catch fish anymore. You're going to catch people. Simon was confused as usual, and his friends didn't really know what Jesus meant. But they were convinced it could only be something good. So they pulled in their boats, left the fish, the nets, the oars, and everything behind, and they ran after Jesus. Jesus ended up in a local town where people were following him everywhere again. And while he was walking along, a man ran up to him and knelt down at his feet. This man had a horrible skin disease. All his skin was falling off, and he looked all lumpy and bumpy. Ew. Everyone always avoided people like him. They didn't want to catch their germs, and they were always asking for money. But Jesus didn't avoid him. Jesus stopped and looked him in the eye. You can fix me, Jesus. I know you can. If you want to, you have the power to make me better. Of course I want to. You're healed. That's it. The man's skin immediately looked fresh and new. He didn't even have any scars. All the lumpy, bumpy bits were gone. He was so happy, he couldn't wait to tell everyone. But just as he turned to leave, Jesus said, "Don't tell anyone what happened. Just pop along and see a priest, and then people won't have to avoid you anymore because they'll see that you're well." Don't tell anyone? That's crazy. Jesus did something super awesome, and he doesn't want anyone to know. Weird. Why would he do that? Why do you think Jesus didn't want the man to tell anyone what had happened? Jesus kept on meeting people, talking to them, teaching them, healing them, eating with them, and just generally being amazing. But Jesus always made sure he took some time out. He often disappeared off on his own just so he could talk to God and listen to what he might have to say. Why do you think Jesus needed some time out? What kind of things do you do to take time out? When could you take some time out to talk to God and listen to what he might have to say to you? After a while, the news about Jesus spread to the Pharisees and their friends in the area. When they heard what Jesus was doing and saying, they were very suspicious of him. They didn't like the fact that Jesus was stirring up the people, getting them excited, causing chaos. They decided they'd have to see for themselves what all the fuss was about. So they chose a day and all went to find Jesus and check him out. Did you know the Pharisees were a group of people who were absolutely obsessed with God's laws? They made sure that everyone followed the laws to the letter. In fact, they actually took things a bit too far. Keep reading to find out what Jesus said to them. They traveled for miles and miles just to see what Jesus was up to. When they arrived, they saw that what people had been saying was true. But they also saw something they really didn't expect. As usual, everyone was crowding around Jesus, shouting about their sore elbows, their dodgy knees, and their minky skin. They knew Jesus could heal them. And they just wouldn't go away. Jesus couldn't get out of the house he was in because there were so many people pushing to get in the door. Some people were carrying a man on a blanket because he couldn't walk. And they wanted Jesus to heal him. But they couldn't get through the crowd, let alone through the door. Then one of them had an idea. We can't go under the crowd. We can't go around the crowd. We can't go through the crowd, so let's go over them. He climbed up onto the roof of the house and started pulling off the tiles until he made a huge hole. I mean, imagine what if that's your roof. Some random people just arrive and start pulling bits off. Everyone inside stared up at him. Then a bulging blanket began to come down slowly through the hole. When the blanket finally arrived on the floor, it unfolded to reveal a man lying there. He couldn't move, and he hadn't been able to for years. Lots of people looked at Jesus to see how he'd react, but he simply smiled and said, "My friend, your sins are forgiven." What a strange thing to say. Why didn't he just say, "You're healed," or something? What is sin? Christians talk about it all the time, maybe too much of the time, actually, but what even is it? Basically, a sin is just a fancy word for saying not loving God properly. A sin is a thought, an action, a word, or anything that we do that God wouldn't want. The trouble with sin is that it gets in the way of a good relationship with God, because God really doesn't like sin. But the great thing is that he does love us. And so he wants to forgive us and start over. When the Pharisees and the temple geeks heard Jesus say, "Your sins are forgiven," they got pretty mad. Who does he think he is? He's breaking all the rules. Only God can forgive sins. He's just old Joe's boy from Nazareth. But Jesus stood his ground and said, "Why do you think I'm breaking all the rules? What's easier, telling this man he's forgiven or telling him he's healed? The Son of Man has the right to forgive sin." He really does think he's God, doesn't he? How else does he think he can forgive sins? They muttered. "Go on, get up, take your blanket and walk home," said Jesus. The Pharisees and temple geeks stopped muttering and stared, along with the rest of the crowd, as the man stood up with no trouble at all, folded up his blanket, and wandered off, waving his arms in the air and shouting about how amazing God is. Even though everyone knew Jesus was healing people, they also knew he was saying incredible things about himself. They knew he was pushing it with the Pharisees and the temple geeks, but they just couldn't stop being amazed every single time. Later on, when the crowds had eventually died down, Jesus went out for a walk. It didn't take long before he saw another crowd of people, except this time they weren't lining up to get a glimpse of him. They were actually lining up to pay their taxes. They hated paying taxes, but they hated the tax collectors even more. Tax collectors were always stealing, cheating, and lying their way into getting more money off people. So they always took more than they were supposed to, and there was nothing anyone could do. Jesus pushed in right to the front of the line and told the tax collector, his name was Levi. Levi took Jesus back to his house and threw a massive party. They had loads of food, and Levi invited all his tax collector friends and their friends around too. The Pharisees and the temple geeks were still hanging around, spying on Jesus. They were getting pretty grumpy now too. Not only does this guy think he's God, but he's hanging around with scoundrels, lying, cheating, thieving scoundrels. Jesus heard the Pharisees grumbling outside. He came out and said to them, "You don't get it, do you? If you're well, you don't need a doctor. If you're ill, then you do. I didn't come here to hang out with all the nice people and tell them all about God. I came to save sinners. Jesus went back inside and left the Pharisees to their grumbles. Everyone was enjoying the party, eating, drinking, talking, laughing, dancing, more eating. A few people came to Jesus and said, "We've heard that your followers never go without food or drink. John's followers," yep, that's the hairy locust John from earlier, "go without food." They do go without food to help them pray. So why don't yours? Jesus told him that his followers didn't need to go without food and drink while he was still around, but one day he wouldn't be around anymore. And then his followers would sometimes stop eating and drinking to help them pray. The people thought it was a bit odd for Jesus to be talking about him not being around. He was young, fit, healthy, popular, well, mostly. So it'd be years before he wasn't around anymore. They were about to go back to the party when Jesus spoke again. If you've got old clothes, you don't cut up new fabric to patch them. The new fabric would need time to shrink before you used it, so it just wouldn't work with the old material. It just would make the holes even worse. If you've got old wine skins, you wouldn't put new wine in them. They'd burst, and you'd waste all your wine. You'd put new wine in new wineskins, wouldn't you? People think old wine is best, but they forget that the new wineskin will be even better in the end. Wineskins. What is Jesus talking about? 2,000 years ago, people didn't have wine bottles. They just had these leather pouches to store their wine in. They worked well for a while, but wine made them stretch, and then eventually they'd burst. The people thought Jesus was talking in riddles. They weren't really sure what he meant, but they wanted to know. They knew clothes and wineskins, and they really liked old wine, but maybe Jesus was onto something. Why was he so convinced that the new wine would be better? Jesus often used stories and pictures to get his point across because he wanted people to understand what he was saying. Sometimes they didn't get it though, and even today, we have to really think about it to figure out what he meant. What do you think Jesus was getting at? Join us tomorrow as our adventure continues.